On the morning of April 1, 1945, the waters off Okinawa churned with the wake of the largest armada ever assembled in the history of naval warfare, a sprawling chaotic city of steel stretching to the horizon under a slate-gray sky. It was Easter Sunday, officially L-Day for the invasion of Okinawa, but for the sailors of the British Pacific Fleet, operating as Task Force 57, it was another day in the crosshairs of a dying empire's desperation. The atmosphere was thick with a specific kind of dread that had become endemic to the Pacific theater in the final year of the war, a fear not of conventional ballistics, but of the fanatical, guided weapon known as the kamikaze. Aboard the flagship carriers of the Royal Navy, British crews stood at action stations, their eyes scanning the cloud layers for the telltale glint of a Mitsubishi Zero or a Yokozuka D4Y Judy. Among them were American liaison officers, men seasoned by years of brutal combat who had witnessed the carnage unleashed upon their own wooden-decked carriers. They knew the physics of destruction intimately. They knew that a single aircraft, turned into a missile and packed with high explosives, could crack a ship open like an eggshell, turning the hangar deck into an inferno that would burn for days. They braced themselves for the inevitable catastrophe, expecting to see the same horrors they had witnessed on the USS Franklin or the USS Bunker Hill. But as the sun climbed higher over the Ryukyu Islands, these American observers were about to witness a demonstration of naval architecture that would overturn everything they thought they understood about survivability. A revelation forged not in the wide expanse of the Pacific, but in the anxious pre-war strategic planning for the Mediterranean. At 7:28 hours, the inevitable materialized in the form of a lone Japanese Zero. Diving out of the low cloud cover toward HMS India, the anti-aircraft batteries erupted, a cacophony of pom-poms and orlikans filling the sky with black puffs of flak, and two Seafire pilots managed to rake the intruder with cannon fire, shredding its fuselage. But the pilot, driven by the grim fatalism of the divine wind, held his line. The aircraft, already breaking apart, looped over the carrier and slammed down onto the flight deck at the base of the island's superstructure. The impact was sickeningly loud, a collision of metal and kinetic energy at 300 miles per hour, followed instantly by the detonation of a 550-pound bomb. To the watching Americans, the sequence of events was terrifyingly familiar. The flash, the smoke, the debris. In the United States Navy, a hit like this meant a ship out of action. It meant the bomb punching through the flight deck, exploding in the hangar below among fueled aircraft, and initiating a chain reaction that would kill hundreds. The American liaison officers on Indefatigable instinctively checked their watches, calculating the months of repair time this ship would now require at Pearl Harbor or Bremerton, assuming it didn't sink outright. However, as the smoke began to clear, the narrative did not follow the American script. There was no deep guttural roar of secondary explosions from the bowels of the ship. There was no buckling of the hull plates from internal pressure. Instead, the damage control teams on Indefatigable were already moving, not with the frantic desperation of men fighting to save a dying ship, but with the methodical precision of janitors cleaning up a spill. The bomb had not penetrated. The Zero had smashed itself against 3 inches of armored steel, a flight deck designed to withstand the very forces that were now tearing the U.S. Navy's carrier force apart. The explosion had scoured the deck, killed 14 brave men, and destroyed the sickbay, but the structural integrity of the carrier remained absolute. The hangar, the beating heart of the ship where the aircraft and fuel were stored, was untouched, protected by the armored roof of the Citadel. 37 minutes after the kamikaze struck a time frame that would barely allow an American crew to unroll fire hoses, the first Seafire fighter circled the ship and landed safely on the flight deck. The crater had been filled with quick-drying concrete, the wreckage swept over the side, and the war continued. An American officer, stunned by the casual efficiency of the recovery, listened as his British counterpart uttered a phrase that would echo through naval history, encapsulating the difference in philosophies. When a kamikaze hits a United States carrier, it's 6 months repair at Pearl Harbor. When a kamikaze hits a limey carrier, it's just a case of sweepers. Man your brooms. To understand this moment of divergence, one must look back a decade before the fires of Okinawa, to the corridors of the British Admiralty and the mind of Rear Admiral Sir Reginald Henderson. In the mid-1930s, while American naval architects were designing carriers for the vast, open distances of the Pacific Ocean, prioritizing speed and maximizing the number of aircraft carried, the British were looking at a very different map. Henderson, who served as Third Sea Lord, recognized that the Royal Navy's likely battleground would be the narrow seas, the Mediterranean, the North Sea, and the English Channel. These were waters where a ship could never truly hide, waters that were always within the striking range of land-based bombers. The Abyssinian crisis of 1935 had brought this vulnerability into sharp focus. The British fleet, exercising in the Mediterranean, found itself living under the constant shadow of the Italian Regia, in an era before effective radar and before the concept of a combat air patrol was fully matured. The prevailing doctrine was that the bomber will always get through. Henderson realized that relying solely on fighter aircraft to intercept incoming attacks was a gamble the Royal Navy could not afford to take. If the bombers were going to get through, The carriers had to be able to take the hit and keep fighting. This realization birthed the concept of the armored hangar carrier, a radical departure from standard naval design. The prevailing wisdom of the time, followed strictly by the Americans and the Japanese, was that the flight deck was merely a superstructure, a lightweight wooden platform built on top of the ship to facilitate takeoffs and landings. It offered no structural strength and certainly no protection. The true armor deck was buried deep within the ship, protecting the engines and magazines. Henderson argued for moving the armor up. He proposed turning the hangar into a steel box, an armored citadel protected by 4.5-inch bulkheads and capped with a 3-inch thick steel flight deck. This deck would serve a dual purpose. It would be the shield against enemy bombs, and it would also be the strength deck of the ship. The primary structural element bearing the stress of the hull, it was an engineering nightmare. Placing hundreds of tons of steel that high up on a ship threatened to make it top-heavy and unstable. Naval architect W.WWII Forbes spent months wrestling with the mathematics, balancing weight distribution against protection, eventually creating a design that was unprecedented in naval history. The result was the illustrious class, and later the indomitable and implacable classes ships built like battleships from the hangar deck up. The trade-off for this invulnerability was offensive capacity. Because the armored hangar was heavy, it had to be smaller. The British carriers could carry only about half the number of aircraft as their American counterparts, typically 36 to 54 planes. Compared to the 80 to 100 aboard an Essex-class carrier, the Americans, with their doctrine of massive offensive strikes, viewed this as a fatal flaw. They believed the best defense was a good offense, a massive combat air patrol that would shoot down the enemy before they could reach the fleet. For the first few years of the Pacific War, the American philosophy seemed superior. The vast distances allowed the U.S. Navy to use their radar and fighters to intercept attacks, and their massive air groups allowed them to pummel Japanese island defenses. But by 1945, the war had changed. The enemy was no longer launching conventional bombing runs. They were hurling themselves at the ships in suicide attacks that radar struggled to track, and fighters struggled to stop entirely. The Divine Wind did not care about air superiority. It only needed one plane to slip through the net. And when they did, the difference between American wood and British steel became a matter of life and death. The disparity in survivability was brutally illustrated. On May 4, 1945, when the kamikazes returned to Task Force 57 in force, a Zero emerged from the clouds and struck HMS Formidable, crashing into the flight deck near the island. The impact was tremendous, creating a 2-foot square hole and depressing the armor plate over a 20-foot area. Splinters of steel and fragments of the bomb penetrated downward, piercing the hangar deck and rupturing a boiler room uptakes, filling the center of the ship with steam. 8 men were killed and 47 wounded. On an American carrier, a hit of this magnitude, penetrating into the ship's vitals, would have likely resulted in a mission. Yet, the armor had done its primary job. It had shattered the bomb's casing and absorbed the bulk of the explosive energy before it could ignite the aviation fuel stores or the ordnance in the hangar. The fires were contained. The ship did not list. Within 5.5 hours, the damage control teams had welded steel plates over the hole, filled the depression with concrete and timber, and HMS Formidable was launching aircraft again. Captain Philip Ruck-Keene, surveying the damage, signaled the fleet commander with a dry wit that belied the violence of the afternoon. "Little yellow bastard." Admiral Philip Vian, knowing the resilience of his ships, replied simply, "Are you addressing me?" Minutes after Formidable was struck, the kamikazes turned their attention to Admiral Vian's flagship, HMS Indomitable. The attack profile was nearly perfect as Zero, diving from 3,000 feet at a steep 60-degree angle. But as the anti-aircraft fire tore into the plane, setting it ablaze, the pilot lost control in the final seconds. Instead of crashing through the deck, the plane belly flopped onto the armored steel. In a spectacle that defied the laws of probability, the aircraft skidded across the unyielding metal surface, bounced over the port side, and exploded harmlessly in the water. Burning petrol washed over the deck, but there was no penetration, no internal fire, and 0 casualties aboard the ship. An American liaison officer standing on the bridge was incredulous. He had watched the plane hit. He had braced for the explosion that would rip the bow off. When he was told the ship would continue operations immediately, he reportedly threw his hat on the deck and stomped on it, shouting that a U.S. carrier would have been finished. It was a moment of cognitive dissonance. The American experience had conditioned him to equate a direct hit with devastation. But here, the physics of the encounter were fundamentally different. The armor turned the ship into an anvil, and the kamikaze was merely a hammer that shattered upon impact. The resilience of the British fleet was further tested on May 9th. When HMS Victorious was struck twice within minutes, the first kamikaze, carrying a 500-pound bomb, crashed into the deck, shearing off its undercarriage and sliding 80 feet before falling over the side. The armor depressed 3 inches but did not break. Fire suppression systems, far more advanced than the American equivalents, doused the burning gasoline immediately. 6 minutes later, a second kamikaze struck. Yet, Despite taking 2 suicide hits in the span of a coffee break, Victorious was launching planes within an hour. Admiral Vian nicknamed the ship the Trojan, a testament to its refusal to stop working. Later that same afternoon, HMS Formidable, having been patched up from the May 4th attack, was hit again. This time, the impact depressed the deck 4.5 inches and destroyed 7 parked aircraft. But again, the Citadel held. The armored box contained the violence. 48 minutes later, flight operations resumed to fully appreciate the miracle of the British survival rates. One must look at the carnage occurring in the American fleet during the same time frame. On May 11th, the USS Bunker Hill, an Essex-class carrier with a wooden flight deck, was hit by 2, the first bomb smashed through the flight deck as if it were paper, detonating in the hangar below. The second plane crashed into the island. The American doctrine of maximizing offensive power meant that the Bunker Hill had heavily fueled and armed aircraft parked on the flight deck, ready for launch. The kamikaze impacts ignited these planes, creating a rolling inferno of exploding ordnance and burning aviation fuel that consumed the ship. The gasoline flowed down through the wooden planks, spreading the fire into the lower decks. There was no armored citadel to contain it. The result was 389 dead and 264 wounded. The ship did not sink, a testament to American damage control bravery, but she was gutted. She limped back to the shipyard and never flew planes again for the rest of the war. The USS Franklin suffered an even worse fate in March, hit by conventional bombs that penetrated the wood. The resulting secondary explosions from her own ordnance killed over 800 men. The contrast was absolute. British carriers took hits and kept fighting. American carriers took hits and turned into crematoriums. The statistical divergence was undeniable. Across the entire campaign, British carriers suffered an average of 7 deaths per kamikaze impact. American carriers, when hit while their decks were spotted with aircraft, suffered hundreds. The British armor prevented penetration in 5 out of 6 major hits. American wooden decks were penetrated in nearly 90% of impacts. But it wasn't just the steel plates that saved lives. It was a difference in safety culture. The Royal Navy, operating with a healthy paranoia about fire, stored their aviation fuel in cylindrical tanks surrounded by seawater, and purged the lines with carbon dioxide when not in use. They had enclosed fire-resistant hangars. The Americans, prioritizing speed of operations, had open-sided hangars to allow engines to be warmed up below deck, huge fuel lines that remained pressurized, and a reliance on the speed of the launch rather than the safety of the storage. The British accepted a lower operational tempo, fewer planes, slower handling in exchange for the certainty that the ship would survive to fight the next day. The Americans gambled on overwhelming force, a gamble that paid off strategically but exacted a terrible toll in human lives. When the enemy managed to break through, this difference in capability was not lost on the highest levels of command. Admiral Raymond Spruance, the commander of the U.S. Fifth Fleet and a man known for his cool, calculating intellect, made a decision in April 1945 that served as the ultimate validation of Henderson's design. After the USS Hancock was severely damaged, Spruance specifically ordered the British Task Force 57 to detach and strike the Sakishima Islands and the airfields on Formosa, Taiwan. These were the hornets' nests from which the kamikazes were launching. Spruance deliberately sent the British into the area of highest threat because, as he reasoned, the armored British carriers would be less vulnerable to the inevitable counterattacks. It was a tacit admission that for this specific kind of dirty close-range brawling, the American thoroughbreds were too fragile, and the British Clydesdales were required. The U.S. Navy, the largest and most powerful maritime force the world had ever seen, was using the Royal Navy as its shield. However, the story of the armored carriers is not one of unblemished triumph. There was a hidden cost to the British design, one that would only become apparent after the guns fell silent. The laws of physics dictate that energy must go somewhere. On an American carrier, the wooden deck allowed the bomb to pass through, and the blast was often vented out through the open sides of the hangar. The ship would burn, but the whole structure often remained sound. On the British carriers, the armored box absorbed the entire kinetic shock of the impact. The energy that didn't penetrate the armor traveled through the ship's frame. The hull girders, the very spine of the vessel, were subjected to massive, violent tremors with every hit and near miss. By the end of the war, though they looked intact from the outside, the British carriers were twisted and deformed internally. The hulls were slightly warped, the alignment of the shafts compromised. They had survived the battle, but they had sacrificed their longevity to do so. Hum's Formidable and Indomitable were scrapped in the 1950s, their frames too tired to be worth repairing. The American Essex-class carriers, once repaired of their fire damage, served for decades, fighting in Korea and Vietnam. It was an ironic reversal. The British ships were better at surviving the war, but the American ships were better at surviving the peace. Yet, the legacy of the British armored carrier transcends the fate of the individual hulls. In the immediate aftermath of the war, as the U.S. Navy looked toward the future of jet aviation, they realized that the era of the wooden flight deck was over. Jets were heavier and faster. They needed stronger decks and better protection. The USS Midway, commissioned just days after the war ended, was the first American carrier to feature an armored flight deck, a direct nod to the lessons learned from the British. But the technology transfer went deeper. The British, forced to innovate due to their lack of resources, developed 3 technologies that would make modern carrier aviation possible. The first was the steam catapult, invented by Commander C.C. Mitchell, which provided the power necessary to fling heavy jets into the air. The second was the angled flight deck, conceived by Captain D.R.F. Campbell, which allowed planes to land without crashing into the aircraft parked for Yoda, safety innovation that solved the very problem that had doomed the USS Bunker Hill. The third was the mirror landing site, which allowed pilots to land with precision on a moving deck. The U.S. Navy, with great humility, adopted all 3. The modern American the undisputed king of the oceans, is American in size and power, but its fundamental design DNA is British. The story of the armored flight deck is a testament to the importance of diversity in engineering philosophy. If the Allies had all built ships the American way, the toll at Okinawa would have been catastrophically higher. If they had all built ships the British way, the offensive power needed to crush the Japanese Navy across the vast Pacific might never have been generated. The victory was achieved because both philosophies were present, covering each other's weaknesses. But for the sailors who stood on the decks of the indefatigable, formidable, victorious, and indomitable, in the spring of 1945, the debate was not academic. It was visceral. They watched as the sky filled with smoke and fire, and they watched as their ships shook off blows that should have killed them. They saw the scrambled eggs on the steel plates, and they knew they owed their lives to the foresight of a man named Henderson who, years before, had looked at a map of the Mediterranean and decided that, above all else, the ship must survive. When the history of the Pacific War is written, the numbers tell a brutal truth. American blood proved that the divine wind was working. British steel proved it could be stopped. The image of the American liaison officer stomping on his hat in disbelief remains the defining vignette of this technological clash. It captures the shock of the new, the realization that the rules had changed. The British carriers were not just ships. They were armored citadels that refused to burn, refused to sink, and refused to yield. They were the shield that allowed the sword of the Allied fleet to strike the final blow. And while the ships themselves were eventually broken up for scrap, victims of the very stress they had endured to save their crews, their spirit lives on in every steel-decked carrier that patrols the oceans today. The concept of the armored deck, born from the fear of the bomber in the narrow seas, ultimately conquered the largest ocean on Earth.